It's lies. It's all lies. What you've heard all these years, the rumors that people have spread, don't believe them. They're all lies. And I'm here this morning to set the record straight. When I think of the things that people have said, I mean, I'm not a bad man. You can ask any of my neighbors. I mean, I go regularly to the synagogue. I bring my sacrifices to the temple. Admittedly, it's not all that much, but I give from what I have just the same. I'm spoken of well by most who know me. You would think I would be entitled to be treated fairly. And yet of late I've been disturbed by some of the things being said about me, and by good church-going people, no less. They've been maligning my good name. They've been spreading vicious rumors. I want you to know there's no truth to what they said. They're lies. And I'm here this morning to set the record straight. Forgive me for carrying on so. It's just, I get so worked up when I think of the stories that are being told. I guess I should introduce myself. You can call me Reuben. I hail from the region you know as Israel. Specifically, I come from a small town in the region of Judea. In my time, my town had a long, rich history. After centuries before I was ever born, Jacob, Isaac's son, chose to bury his wife Rachel on the outskirts of our town. And later, Ruth and Naomi of your Old Testament scriptures both hailed from my little village. But our greatest claim to fame was the fact that in the early years of our nation, a young boy from our village had been chosen by God to become the king over the nation of Israel. Many said one of the greatest of our kings. His name was David. And I believe some of you may have heard of him. He started out as a shepherd. He went on to become a great military leader, a writer of songs, and ultimately the second and greatest king our nation ever saw. Of course, this all happened centuries before my time, but we still remember it. Even in my day, people rarely referred to our town by its proper name. They would call it the City of David instead of its proper name. Bethlehem. Bethlehem is located about 5 miles south of the great city of Jerusalem. The very name Bethlehem, do you know what it means? It means house of bread. And while that may seem strange to you, if you understand something about the region, it will make sense. Much of the region of Judea and surrounding areas made up of relatively barren land and wilderness. To the south, there's the wilderness of Sinai. To the east, there's the Jordan Valley. And beyond that, the landscape of Moab. And beyond that, vast empty spaces of desert. But in and around Bethlehem, you find a different scene. We're surrounded by gentle foothills, some rugged terrain, but as you near Bethlehem, the landscape changes and the barren foothills give way to fields of wheat and groves of olive trees and fig palms. And so that region is called the House of Bread because of the fertileness of that valley, the area around the town. I spent most of my life in Bethlehem. I traveled around some in my youth, tried my hand at different jobs. Times were hard and you did what you could to survive. But I always returned to Bethlehem. I guess I was always a small town boy at heart. And I married a local girl. We'd known each other since we were children. Our marriage had been arranged by our parents from our youth. And by your standards, you might say we had a very long engagement. We'd been betrothed from the time that we were little, long before we were actually... Oh, what's that you said? Oh, you want to know what a betrothal is? It's sort of like you're being engaged. Only in our day, when a couple was betrothed, they were considered, for all practical reasons, to be as good as married. Oh, they still lived separately. They would not share a bed or a home until they were officially married. But unlike your engagements, Jewish law considered the breaking of a betrothal to be a very, very serious matter. The equivalent of a divorce. So we'd been betrothed for some time before we were actually married and shared a home. We had it rough starting out, but in our day, who didn't? We didn't have much, but we managed to get by. When my father died, I inherited a small bit of his property, being his only son. It wasn't much by your standards. A small home on the edge of town with enough land to raise a few crops, and I worked our small field and rented myself out to work the fields of others. Over time, I was able to add a little bit of room onto our home. A small addition, you would say. You might ask, why? Well, you need to know our home was located on the edge of Bethlehem, near the main road that ran north and south from Jerusalem to Hebron. Jerusalem was about 5 miles to the north, Hebron about 12 miles to the south. And the road that ran between those two, the road upon which our home stood, was always fairly busy, and we began to have a fair business providing food and lodging for overnight travelers. Now, I said we managed a fair business. You have to realize these were hard times for all. It had been in my grandfather's day that the Romans had come in and conquered our land. I lived my entire life under Roman rule. It was a common sight to see Roman soldiers on the road, Roman garrisons in the larger cities, and the law required that I, if necessary, provide food and lodging for soldiers if they demanded it. Not that it was all bad, mind you. The Roman taxes were high, but for the most part, the Romans were known for being relatively fair with our people. They even went out of their way to make special exceptions. When it came to the Jewish people, in most of the lands that Rome conquered, you were required, upon being conquered, to embrace the Roman gods and worship them. But they allowed us Jews to continue to worship our one God. They allowed the temple in Jerusalem to continue to operate. In all honesty, it wasn't because they were that fair-minded. They just found us to be a very stubborn and difficult people when it came to matters of our religion. So they allowed us to maintain temple worship and worship our one God as a means of trying to appease us. I have to admit, I disliked having to house and feed Roman soldiers whenever they passed through, but that really was a rarity. More often than not, they just stopped for a brief rest or maybe a meal before pressing on to the nearest garrison. They preferred to stay in the larger cities. You see, I'm afraid our little village had very little to offer them in the way of entertainment. Had there been soldiers in our home that night, things might have been far different. It was when Caesar Augustus was emperor on the throne and Quirinius was the governor of the region of Syria, there was an edict proclaimed concerning a new census and, of course, in good Roman tradition, a tax. The proclamation required every person had to return to their hometown, the place of their birth, to be registered in the census and to be taxed by the government. That proved to be for many, that proved to be a hardship because travel was not easy in those days. But for my wife and I, it proved to be a blessing. After all, my home was in Bethlehem. I had no great distance to travel. And meanwhile, because of the edict, the roads were full of travelers, more than willing to pay for simple food and a shelter where they could sleep for the night. To be fair, I gave preference to those whose families I knew. But there were many strangers on the road, and our house was full, frequently to overflowing. My wife and I were kept busy feeding and lodging and making more and more room for guests. It was a very busy time, busier than any time we had seen. And while we didn't grow wealthy, we weren't able to set just a little bit aside for an emergency. I remember that night. It was late. It was past the time when normally guests would be arriving. There was a knock on our door, and I wouldn't even have answered it as it was late, but I feared it might be Roman soldiers insisting on food or lodging. And when I opened the door, there was a man standing there. Nothing exceptional about him. His clothes were dusty from the road. and he seemed both tired and somewhat anxious. "Please, sir," he said, "my wife and I need a place to stay. We'll pay whatever the going rate." "I'm sorry," I told him. I said, we're full. You might try one of the houses down the road. We have no more room." "But sir," he said, "we've traveled all the way from Bethlehem, or from Nazareth." "Nazareth? That's almost 70 miles away." "Yes," he said, "we've been traveling for days. Last night we spent in Jerusalem with friends." I told him I was sorry, there was simply no room left. The house was full. I mean, really, what do they expect me to do? Wake up my paying guests and ask them to leave or make room? He seemed rather worried, and he looked at me with concern, and he said, "It's my wife. She's pregnant, and she's about to give birth. We must find a place for the night." By this time, my wife had come to the door to see what was taking so long. When she asked what was the matter, I quickly told her the man's story. "I suppose," I said, they could stay in the stable." And she turned to our daughter and got her help and headed out to prepare a place. I turned to the man and said, "Listen, it's not much, but it's all I have left. There's a stable out back. It's really just a small cave. It's not elegant, but it will at least give you and your wife some privacy. My wife and daughter will prepare a place for you." And I heard the man talking to his wife, who for the first time I could see off in the shadows. She was sitting on a donkey, and I heard her tell him, "Don't worry, Joseph. God will take care of everything." My wife and I were up most of the night. Aside from providing for paying guests in our home, we tried to see that the couple in the stable had what little we could provide for them. My wife had helped deliver babies before, so she helped the woman with the delivery. It was a boy. A baby boy. The most beautiful baby boy I had ever laid eyes on. I saw to it that the woman's husband had at least clean straw and some rags to lay in the manger so the child might have a place to sleep up off of the cold ground. And I was just about to return to the house for the night when I saw a group of people walking towards the stable. "We have no room, go away," I said, but they continued walking, and as they drew closer, I saw that they were shepherds. I could tell by their dress, and I could tell by their smell. "What do you want?" I demanded. "I have no room for you. Go back to the fields where you belong." They looked at me with a strange look in their eyes and said simply, "Where's the baby?" "The baby? How could you know about the baby? The baby's only a few hours old." "We are shepherds," they said, "and we were watching our fields in the countryside when an angel of God appeared to us and told us of the child's birth. We have heard the song of heaven's choirs. This is no ordinary child. He is the Messiah." I could hardly believe my ears. I wouldn't have believed them, but something about the look in their eyes and the tone of their voice made me believe them. The Messiah. You mean this tiny infant born in my stable is the Savior? And I watched as they quietly approached the little cave where the mother and father stood and the child in the manger, and then quietly and reverently, each one by one, knelt down before the child. I would have never imagined this road-weary couple's little baby was the Messiah of Israel. The one who would deliver us all. The one whom the prophets had foretold. The one for whom our people had waited for centuries. I didn't know. How could I know? If If only I'd known, I would have given them the best place in my home. If I had known, I would have given them a place of honor. I don't know what became of the child. The next morning, the parents and the child went into the village and found relatives there with whom they could stay, and I never saw them again. I suppose they may have returned to Nazareth, but some claim they'd heard they'd gone as far as traveling to Egypt. But for years, I remembered that night. And I remembered their visit, and I remembered the words of those shepherds. And I wondered about the destiny of that little baby. Now, I know what you're thinking, but it's not true. For years, you have judged me wrongly. You are guilty of helping to spread the vicious lies and rumors, but I'm here to set the record straight, to see that you know the truth about that night and the role that I played. I did not turn them away. I don't care what you've heard, I don't care what you've been told. When the Messiah was born on that night long ago, I did not refuse him a place. I merely did what many of you have done, time and time again. That's right, many of you are just as guilty as I am. You see, I didn't turn the Christ away. I merely did what you have done. I gave him what I had left. Admit it, some of you are guilty of giving to Christ only the leftovers of your life, offering to him what cost you little or nothing. Sure, I could have turned out other guests, I could have made room for him, but it was easier, it was more convenient to just give him the stable. So before you're too quick to stand in judgment over me, maybe you better examine your own hearts. Many of you run your lives like I ran my inn. You always seem to have your heart filled with other things. You're always too busy for Christ. Your heart, your life is crowded with so many things. You could make room for him, but that would mean having to let some other things go. Some of the guests you've made at home in your heart. Guests of pride and reputation, selfishness, greed, lust, bitterness, materialism, even the guest of convenience. Yes, your hearts are busy inns with no room for Christ to be born or dwell there. And like me, many of you will try to satisfy your conscience by offering to God what you have left. You may not send him to the stable, but you offer him your leftover time, your leftover money, your leftover service. And like me, you try to fool yourself into believing that he ought to be glad to even get that. But deep down in your hearts, you've always known that he wants more than just your leftovers. He wants more than simply a convenient part of your life. And you know he deserves more. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't simply give to Christ what is left, what is easy, what is convenient. If I had known on that night what I know now, I would have turned away every paying guest. I would have joyfully paid them back double what they had paid me. I would have willingly offered my home, my own bed, the best that I had, all for the privilege of welcoming the Christ into my heart and home. You know, in a way, I envy you. Many of you know who he is. You know who it is who knocks on your heart's door seeking entrance. You have opportunity to make him welcome, to give him your finest and best. And yet some of you turn him away. Still others allow him to enter, but like me, only give what's convenient or easy. Some of you have welcomed him into your heart, and yet you share your joy with no one. Had the Prince of Peace been born into my home, I would have gladly awakened everyone in Bethlehem to share that good news. But as it was, I was embarrassed to admit that Christ was born in my stable, because that was all that I would give him. I hope, I pray that each one of you will open wide your hearts to him as he knocks. Don't miss the opportunity to welcome him in. It would be your great loss to turn him away and you dishonor him when you give him less than your best. I only did what you have done 1,000 times or more. When Joseph came to Bethlehem and knocked upon my door, I did not turn the Christ away with alibi so deft. Like you, I simply gave to him whatever I had left. Perhaps he walks your streets tonight, the child of Bethlehem. Beneath the blazing lights which form the city's diadem, perhaps he finds the inn is full and seeks a lodging where your candle glows upon the sill to bid him welcome there. Let not our hearts be busy inns that have no room for thee, but cradles for the living Christ and his nativity. Still driven by 1,000 cares, the pilgrims come and go. The hurried caravans press on, the inns are crowded so. Here are the rich and busy ones with things that must be sold. No room for simple things within this world that values gold. Still driven by 1,000 cares, the pilgrims come and go. Yet hunger dwells within these walls, these shining walls and bright, and blindness groping here and there without a ray of light. Oh, lest we starve and lest we die in our stupidity, come, Holy Child, within and share our hospitality. Let not our hearts be busy inns that have no room for thee, but cradles of the living Christ and his nativity.